was absolutely entranced by both of your talks, and just for these are all the notes. Clearly, I'm somebody who likes to write when I'm, but there's no way that I'm going to look at those now. I suppose in the overarching theme of what we're here today to do, which is about thinking creatively together. One of the things maybe to just get us going that I'm struck by both of your talks is you were speaking, Louise, about paradigms and the kind of assumptions and values and so on that set up those paradigms in terms of your work. And Shane, you were speaking a bit about the sort of systems that exist, but what struck me most about yours was about that idea of breaking this part that says, this is all going terribly wrong. Let's approach it from a different way. Having heard each other speak, I suppose, Louise, going to you first, was there anything that kind of struck you in what Shane was talking about that related to your work, or that made you think about some of the ideas you were sharing?
I think for me, the bit that really, the bit that stuck with me was that kind of tribal approach to belonging. It's like, I'm here, these are the edges, and this is what keeps me safe, rather than the open-minded and shared experience. I think that was the key thing. Yeah. And Shane, from your perspective, hearing kind of the key points, did you see that interrelation to what you were looking at in terms of democracy and democratic systems?
Yeah, so there's I think a lot of things to say. First of all, you've nailed the science very well. And I was really happy to hear you talk about the interaction between the default mode network and the task positive network, and this idea that in creativity that you have to somehow activate both systems at once. And kind of analogizing that a little, I think we're too task positive focused and we need to step back a little and be a little bit more reflective. That's what our default mode allows us to do. We can envision things across time, across space, in a way that no other species can. I often say, if you imagine this room was a room filled with chimpanzees, well, what would happen? Well, there would be an enormous fight. Chimpanzees are terribly violent. They would be thinking about the fight in the moment. They don't come together in the kind of deliberative way that we do. Other species simply do not sit down and talk and think about futures together and then bind themselves to that in the way that we humans can do. And I don't think we do enough of that.
Yeah, I think it's really one of the things that struck me when both of you were talking, and maybe I'm bringing some of my own lived experience into this now, but it is that in many ways, in terms of what you were speaking about, Shane, we operate in this very, politics and so on, in this very binary, the right route, the wrong route, proceed, stop, and from the perspective of your work, you're talking about how that actually there's a whole space that we're not exploring. There's a whole way of knowing and seeing that we're not exploring. There's having spent almost 20 years now working in the public sector, and for good or for ill health, being subjected to its various processes of governance at various points along the way. What always struck me was that I'm absolutely desperate in every single annual report that I've written, and I've written many, to include a chapter at the end called What Didn't Work, the failures, the things that went off from what was expected, what was planned. But our system, our cultural context, our political is not set up for that, because there's a certain kind of you're if you're the person that's going out, I think you were speaking about that a bit, Shane, that you're putting that information out. It's about changing that narrative, that actually that becomes a good, And so I was really interested when I was listening to both of you speaking about that feeling, Louisa, you were talking about being at the edge of a bell curve. And what does it take for us to move or manipulate our culture and society to recognize that the edge of the bell curve has a lot to offer as well in terms of our perspectives, and that actually creating a kind of context where we say, sorry, I got this wrong, without, I think your phrase, Shane, was...
Without humiliation.
Without humiliation, could be a hugely positive thing. I don't know if you've discussed.
Yeah, I suppose, I don't think I'm at the edge of all bell curves. It's just this particular, the way that we are right at the moment. And I would think, and that does tie into what you're saying, that kind of excessive, it's about task, it's about category, and if we can move away from that way of viewing, my research, it is looking at how we learn and very much focused on adolescence at the moment, but like all the research that's coming out is like we learn through it's our emotions are the driver of all learning, and the default mode network and that capacity to reflect is absolutely crucial. So it's not daydreaming. That's where we make all the meaning. That's where everything comes together. But at the moment, if we are focused on that getting things done, we're not giving space to the really important, the emotions, the sensing, the making sense bit. So it's I think it's a whole reframing that it needs to happen.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder, is it a slowing down?
Yeah, well, I always like to say that downtime is absolutely vital for creative life, for productive living, for a healthy social life. We usually get our 7 or 8 hours of downtime, but during the course of the day, this expectation that we should always be on, we should always be producing, it's probably not a healthy thing for us, that we need to be able to step back a little and reflect a bit more. And it should be okay that we're not always on. There's time away from tasks actually is a good thing when you go back to them. You'll enhance problem solving, you'll have a whole lot of other things going on, but this idea that we should have this frenzy of activity all the time, to me, is a very bad idea.
Yeah. I'm going to, I think there's some people with microphones perhaps that I think Dominic mentioned, so I am going to open it out because I think there may be some questions or perhaps interest in the audience from what you've heard. Hi.
Hello, how are you doing? My name is Rachel.
Hi, Rachel. Yeah, we can see the outline of you. Which is,
so my name is Rachel. I'm a clinical psychologist and psychometrician. Part of my work is looking at scores in a tool and correcting for especially those scores that are at the end of the bell curve. I like the way you have spoken about reimagining those edges, making sense out of it. And I'm wondering, because these points represent people with a brain, with a sense. They're making sense, not like they have deficits that make them incapable of acting in humane ways. So how do we reimagine those kind of scores in a mathematical setting, a mathematical model, and reimagine them in an art sense in a way that we can also, again, reimagine them from the art sense and apply that in a mathematical model such that we don't view them as bad scores representing deficits, scores that we need to do away with, but scores that we can rethink and give them meaning where they are instead of doing away with them as outliers, we just label them bad words. So how do we make sense out of the outliers or the scores at the end of the bell curve?
I'm going to go back to Augustine's comment. We need to reimagine how we do science. I did one module on statistics and it terrified me. I remember the word kurtosis because it sounds nice, but that's it. And so, I'm all about the qualitative and what, who is the human and what's the human experience in this. And when we're looking at the statistics, it's one type of knowledge. So maybe it's to broaden the knowledge that we're bringing into that space, to allow for the human in that space. And again, I can talk as a mother and go, for my son, it was always the deficits that we're focused on. He was, is a magnificent photographer. He rose at a really high level, but as far as school were concerned, he was just scraping through because they weren't looking at the full package, or they weren't evaluating the full human that he was. So it's we're very narrow in what we look at in particular contexts, and it's how can we broaden that out to allow for the human, the whole person in those spaces.
Thank you. Do we have any? I think we probably have time for another question if there is one. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hopinder Colcott, with the Atlantic Institute as their new director on innovations and partnerships. Both of those talks were fascinating, and my brain is fizzing with lots of questions. But one of the things I'm really interested in at the moment is looking at the connective tissue that I think both of you referred to in very different ways, but also how you create a sense of that collective thinking through that connective tissue, those elements that connect us. And I'm a little bit worried at the moment in society because technology is actually reducing that connection between people, but also it's impacting the neuropathways in the brain, and particularly teenage neuropathways, to develop the ability to focus, to reflect. And actually there is a lot of evidence coming out that's demonstrating that is reducing significantly. So my question, I guess, is what can we be doing to create that connective tissue for reflection and connective thinking together that will move us into the right direction as communities to be able to come together to look at these problems in a different way? So there's a roadmap that we need to develop. Do you have a sense of what that roadmap could look like, or any advice you can give to us as we work with communities around the globe?
I'm going to go to you, Shane, for that one. You mentioned within the context of your talk that's deliberative thinking space. Do you want to?
Yeah, so humans are really good at deliberative assembly. We're really good at sitting down and talking together. And there's loads of evidence right across the planet from anthropology and loads of other places, or loads of other sources rather, that gathering people together in circumstances where they're not bullied or directed by a chair, but where the idea is that there will be a consensus forged, or not, as the case may be, around the problems that people want to talk about, is a very reasonable thing to do. It's sometimes hard for people to participate because, sitting down in a circle and talking about what ails you or what bugs you about what's going on, and being able to do that in a way that's psychologically safe is hard. But I think we can create such spaces, but we have to be very deliberate about how we do them. There has to be a ritual associated with them. There has to be a means given to the people who want to speak at a particular time to allow them to speak. They need to be shut up at a particular time too, because some people will just go on too much, as we know. Often you have to think very clearly about what the purpose of the gathering is for. Is it a decision-making one? Is it a sense-making one? Is it a meaning-making one? Are you trying to solve a problem now? Is there something in the local community with broken footpaths that you have to take care of? Or are you sitting there to think about, well, what do we want our community to look like over the next 20 years so that it's there for our children or our grandchildren or whatever it happens to be? So we just need to think about these things ahead of time. Can't just assume that just throw people in a group some magic is going to happen. That's not how it works. That's not how humans work together. You need to negotiate a structure, and you need to have a thought about what the purpose of the gathering should be.
Can I just add as well, and I'm, as an arts facilitator, just to build, sometimes words don't come easily to people, and that's where you can bring the arts into those spaces and use the arts to enable people to find the words to work in those spaces.
So I think the overarching piece is different modalities of engagement with people and finding those spaces. I'm getting the time from Dominic here at the left of my eye. So it just remains for me to thank both of our speakers for incredibly powerful and illuminating and thoughtful presentations this morning that I know will stay with people for the day. I'm going to leave you with something that Louise said, which is what you pay attention to isn't everything to be noticed. You can carry that with you for the day. And that Shane's point that course correction is a competence. I love that as well. So with those two thoughts, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day.